Well, hello again. Here's a good question for the yes or no treatment. It's about communism. Is communism a good idea? You might think this is a less relevant question today than it once was, but not so. It still has many ardent believers. So, what is it? Well, the whole notion here is that all of society's problems arrive from a fundamental class conflict. The conflict between the proletariat, that is, the people that do all the work, and the land and property owning bourgeoisie, who appropriate the profits for themselves and leave the poor impoverished. And the only solution to that problem is revolution. And in the revolution, the community, with a help from a state, takes over the ownership of all the means of production, the labor of the proletariat and professional classes that are doing the work, the factories and capital goods, as well as the natural resources of the nation. They own all of that, and they apportion the fruits of those labors to those who need it. So, in the process, of course, what they're doing is eradicating property rights, eradicating even the notion of inheritance, but replacing it with presumably a better and more fair functioning society, and one that offers free healthcare, free education, and so forth. So it sounds like a worthy idea. Its historic roots go back to 1512 or something, the famous work by Thomas More, Utopia, in which he envisaged something like this, the lack of private ownership. Thomas More, of course, eventually got into trouble with Henry VIII, not surprising given this kind of thinking. It was followed up from time to time by other thinkers, and very notably by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract, where he also inveighed against private property. But then most notably by Karl Marx and his associate Friedrich Engels in Das Kapital. And Marx was really one of the great thinkers of the 19th century, perhaps along with Darwin and Freud. And he advocated a system of government, Marxism, socialism, communism, but on which the eventual political philosophy of communism is based. And there are very few communist regimes of any consequence left in the world. The two biggest ones, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, have gradually become more ones of market economies. They're still run by authoritarian governments, but the markets have been opened up. So we don't really have any. We certainly have no successful exemplars, and we don't have many examples left. There's Laos and Vietnam and North Korea and places like that. But it seems in some respects to be a social kind of whimsical artifact, but by the same token, one fervently advocated by some people. So let's look at the arguments. So there are those who say communism is a good idea. Well, of course, the fundamental appeal of communism is that it advocates worthy social goals, the elimination of some bad stuff, wealth inequality, exploitation of labor, and in the hands of large corporations, the destruction of the environment and the use of scarce resources and so forth. So communists are trying to address some problems that many of us view as there's evils in the world, and this is their solution. Here in the early days of the 21st century, the offer of communism also plays to some very current concerns, like, once again, the destruction of the environment, racial discrimination, grotesque wealth inequality, where it is said now that just the wealth of the top three rich men in America, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett, is equal to the wealth of the poorest half of the U.S. population. I don't know if that's true, but if it's even close to being true, it's really kind of, well, it's extreme to say the least. So communism has something to say in today's world, in some of the issues that are of great concern to us. Communism also has a practical kind of side effect, perhaps one not even anticipated by Karl Marx, which is that of the ability to make rapid decisions when confronted with serious problems. Communist nations have never had any difficulty deciding whether or not to go to war. They simply make a decision in the center and then do it. Now, some would say that's not necessarily an advantage, but it certainly eliminates any bad results of delays in necessary decision making. We've seen it, of course, with the coronavirus, whereas the most authoritarian regimes, particularly China, where it all seems to have originated, seem to have done a pretty good job of if not stamping it out, certainly containing it greatly. Far better than the democratic West has. Whereas China can't really be seen to be a pure communist country anymore, it certainly calls itself that. The Communist Party rules China with an iron fist. Even though it's become more of a market economy, it is still it really is still the archetype, prototype communist nation in the world, and so it has performed a lot better than the rest of us have in confronting the problems of the virus. So that's a pretty impressive performance. So what that says is that given the right kind of challenge, communism can work quite well. So those are some reasons, both kind of ideological and with a little bit of practicality thrown in as well, why some people believe that communism is relevant and relevant today, not just in the past. Well, of course there are many who oppose it and who say that it's just not a good idea, it doesn't work, and so forth. So first of the objections is a kind of a philosophical one, which is there's a kind of an ideological hubris about this advocacy of communism. The idea that the people who advocate it have all the answers, that it's really not up for debate. The only thing that's important is to attack wealth and private property and distribute all the goods, and then everyone will be happy. It's a kind of a dream world, really, which has no basis in reality. A second objection is, of course, that it doesn't really work. The only economic model that has been shown in history to work is a market model, one with supply and demand, one that allows for competition among producers to always strive to have the best product or service and thus satisfy the needs of consumers. And when you eliminate that, when only the state controls the means of production, so when the notion of a market economy where people can choose among many available alternatives, when you defeat that, by definition, you're going to have a lower quality of goods and services on offer. And as we look at the recent history of communism, you cannot find the goods, particularly consumer goods, of any communist country that anybody ever wanted. I mean, how many products do you have in your home made by Russians or North Koreans or Cubans for that matter? You have products made by the Chinese, but only really since the market-based reforms of Chairman Deng in 1978, I think it was, after the destructive anti-market philosophy of Mao Zedong. And so the fundamental objection, therefore, is contained in this, that communism demonstrably doesn't work. Maybe you have a few improvements in healthcare and education, but it eventually leads to dissatisfaction because of abjectly poor financial performance and market performance, and eventually either fails or becomes an oppressive police state. Finally, Marx, of course, envisaged that the notion of the state taking over the top-down management of the economy was part of a kind of a transition state from the capitalist world to the state where the community basically owned the means of production and would allocate it for itself. So the interim state of the central government making all the decisions top-down was envisaged as temporary. Of course, it never is, because they don't want to go away. And as a consequence of that, it leads to an oppressive authoritarian regime eventually. And in every one of the countries that we're talking about, such has been the case. And it leads, as it has in Cuba and in North Korea and in China and in Russia and so forth, it leads to the locking up of political dissidents, the suppression of free speech. In fact, what's going on in Hong Kong right now, as communism is being imposed on a somewhat capitalist economy under the British, it is a very unpleasant place to be for the average citizen. Nice if you're in the conducting the levers of power at the center, but not for anyone else. So there you have probably the two biggest objections to communism. Number one, that it simply doesn't work effectively for the good of the people and for the good of the wealth of the nation. And number two, it always and inevitably leads to the suppression of any kind of liberty, free speech, human rights, and so forth, and therefore becomes a pretty awful form of political governance. So there you are. That's a pretty bad indictment. Well, what's my take? My take on this one is pretty simple. I've really kind of reviewed it on all of these comments thus far. The problem is that communism does have laudable goals. It does want to address some fairly substantial social evils, and when it is implemented, it fails abjectly and creates a very unpleasant environment in which to live. The usual response to the evils involved are a kind of compromised political system where the state eventually gets enough support of the people to suppress the worst parts of it, and then proceeds accordingly. It does so not very efficiently, not very effectively, sometimes limited by corruption and so forth, but probably does a better job than the dirigiste, doctrinaire forms of communism. So my answer is it's not a good idea. Okay, well, there you have it. I guess that my view won't surprise too many people, and I probably won't have too many objections to it. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give me a like, please subscribe, comment, and so forth, and I will see you at the next one. Bye-bye.